Hello everyone, today we talk about Eurasian civilizational development during the migration era. It's a huge topic, telling the truth, and it comes from just like my manualistic introductory side of the story that every once in a while presents me with this thankless challenge, let's say, to try to say comprehensively sum up such an enormous topic that I don't think I had ever, addressed. Like we talked often about the relation between the sedentaries and the nomads, but this entails also a comparison between the major Eurasian civilizations. We will talk mostly about the Roman Empire, the Guptas, and the Hans fundamentally. As you know, I also cover Asian history, both for ancient and medieval times, mostly about warfare, especially the Eastern. I go, and hopefully we'll come to some point which we will sort of glue this better together with some proper basic history content. Schwerpunkt has huge ambitions, but he's just in the first grade, right? So let's give him time to get a bit older for more interesting stuff. Let's say, or at least something that has to be dealt with more in depth. In fact, I'm also here just presenting with some concepts that are widely debatable and that I hope can provide some food for thought. Because frankly, like in this time of history, like it seems like all the tensions existing around the world make the same sort of paradoxically do not seem to favor some sort of global approach to history. At least say there is a branch of this, but mostly just in the West. I doubt that, I don't know, in China or in other parts of the world there is a like an historiography that takes into consideration these things, and that especially people are taught in especially at school, with some, even intentionality of historical objectivity or whatever, right? And part of the reason why this dynamic occurs is that, of course, most of what has, let's say, there is a necessity of control, right, of the masses, and the depletion actually of their qualitative understanding. We confuse mass schooling of areas that were disaster before with some sort of this is a great educational system, right? That's not exactly what the sap of academic quality actually is. In the West, maintaining the palm and by far of any degree of in spite of all, right, and in spite, as you know very well from which side I lean, so I could speak all this time criticizing and violently, etc. But we do detain, compared to the rest of the world, still the top moral and scientific standards without any trace of any system ever capable to even come minimally close to compare even at this point. And so there is a sense of inferiority that stems from the realization that the West got it, right? And it's not like something we began to do by say inferiorizing the rest of the world. On the contrary, we've been even too open to the idea, especially spreading from the 60s, the 70s, that the broader East, right, the Orient, archetypally meant was instead like something just equal to us, right, or obviously different, but on the same footing, and wanting to expand for the prosperity of mankind, for cooperation, whatever. There is some of it somewhere, not everywhere, especially in some of the the more competitive areas, but I have, in fact, no trust whatsoever in the good faith or intentions of practically anything that I've seen out there in terms of common sentiment, like about people. I don't care whether there is some scholar out there that maybe got it as well, and sort of teaches properly. I could even make names about them, but it's the masses that I look at, right? It's the peoples that I look at, and no, right? There is no way to even think that these countries are capable of having a communication, let alone a dialogue regarding this topic. You can't measure it with, okay, I will not talk about closer countries that also within the geographical Europe are sort of very much outside like the range of any acceptation of the historical awareness that exists, right, just through the massive amount of work that civilization has made, right? Whenever I talk about, let's say, I end up making very niche things, or at least certain talking about topics that I like to dissect in detail, in depth, mostly as a medievalist, as a polemologist. But I realized that for most people, right, the average one, also in the West and pretty much everywhere, meant also in the sense of the broader West, if you want to include, I don't know, Japan or Brazil. This is not for me to discuss now. I don't care, honestly. But let's say the sense, there's this increasing superstitious conviction that essentially history has been told to us in a wrong way, right? And it is true when you look at some ways in which some people make history and get resonance in our world, except that has practically or virtually nothing to do with the actual history that we have accumulated as the West, and that is the history preserved in our libraries, in our oceanic works, in what was sought after as the highest form of culture by the traditional elite that today has almost evaporated completely and leaving space to a conservatism that basically tells you that you shouldn't study at university, especially humanities or whatever, like a noble-blooded individual from just a bit more than 100 years ago. Most of Europe would have simply told you, like, just the lesser people think in a way of this kind. And this has been normalized instead, as if being ignorant was anywhere like something you should be proud of course, to an extent. And we make a lot of difficulties, even as scholars, when we especially, can be a very rare thing in that pursuing this sort of traditional mentality, and trying to restore it, if anything, through what we already know. And so you can imagine how difficult this is, even just from a physical point of view, to try to make the masses reapproach the same. That's part of the reason why I make these videos. I know that it's unlikely, at least at this pacing, that I'm going to be able to make a difference in the first place. But I try my best. I try to sensitize people to the idea that at least they can achieve that, right? Contrary to most of what's eventually the criticism against me, if there is anything, and it's practically all out of here. I don't get it in the comments or whatever. Is that I have contempt towards the lower, statuses. This is true in the sense that I look at the action of it, and yes, it's disgusting, right? But I would never think about that in potential, because that would be betraying essentially the same traditional belief, right? But once that you've been given the opportunity at an infinite level, as tradition, like it's not really an opinion, it's not really a condition you can travalicate, if not by, in fact, achieving divinity yourself. Like, I'm not going to be sympathetic, and actually, I'm not pessimistic, but let's say when I look at the world right now, I realize that there is no major force currently that is able to stiffen the moral and scientific proclivity, right, in the masses. And so there will probably be some phase, if anything, of stagnation. Collapse can occur, but under more serious circumstances that can theoretically be avoided, but also are not really to discard, nor they can be simply foreseen, right? So talking about Eurasia is not easy exactly for this, that we haven't built in the world like a satisfactory historical original mover, say primal mover for the same. Like there is no cooperation first, but there are literally some, say, even in the best, say, of institutions, we do not reason as if we were to try to change like the broader people's mind. The average scholar is a guy who has basically gotten there because of a salary, and that has been into it like through the incredibly say hurried and consequently also scarcely productive ranking, pointage, curriculum, publishing race, let's say, that has dramatically lowered the quality of scientific publications, whatever. And so it's just there to cultivate his own niche, making 90% of bureaucracy and 10% of teaching, but also the latter in this relative reduction being even more reduced by the fact that there is no aim anymore, like it could happen 2 or 3 generations ago, to have a real culture, say a culture that would start not from the kind of education you went through, let's say the kind of university career you went through, but rather the pregressed education, that kind of individual, that personal, moral, and cultural quality that had to be a pregress condition to eventually try to expand through a university curriculum and sort of doctoral and professorial exploit, like enrich the world and molding it and writing things that would really change people's minds, and so on. Other countries of the world have not properly even yet developed a real historiography, in the sense that, at least according to true scientific standards, I mean, most countries are still, still seeing, in fact, like the educational systems as some sort of simple confirmation of the status quo, at least the current political order that these countries try to maintain, especially considering the expansion of, say, the Second World, and so the inherent risks that could emerge from, say, the masses being exposed to knowledge in an uncontrollable way, and the fear of liberalization, etc. But even more strictly historically and scientifically, like some countries have not properly even had the time historically to build a real historiography, right? The way we study, say, I don't know, the Ottoman Empire in the West, broadly meant, is nothing like the way they studied in Turkey, right? They do have, like, they're mostly following us, say, and their educational system is, say, capable, of course, of absorbing this notion, etc. And we're talking about a country that is substantially westernized compared to others, and that, however, can't simply be addressed in a scientific direction when it's going under the political strains and even involutions that we witness today. So you can imagine a country like India, even, that could be like it's being regressing in many ways in a broader sense that is truly political. It's not about being democratic, right? This is about being traditional. That can be also achieved in a completely sclerotic, superstitious, and in fact truly anti-Catholic way, right? According to the beliefs that often existed in these very countries. Think about China, right? That today we will in part discuss, and that was in many ways like one of the, in fact, after Rome, definitely the greatest symbol of the world's imperial grandeur and universal power, and that is today essentially a communist dictatorship. And so you can, and with all the damage that is notoriously being carried out expressly on the Chinese cultural legacy, from an archaeological and historical point of view. So you see it in some countries in Europe. I mean, there are some countries in Europe that came out of socialism, of communism, and haven't had the time to even realize as a people, if you don't want to use the term democratic, that I believe is wrongly used, like in most of our most sort of post-19th century lexicon, right, and heavily influenced by Marxism. It's rather probably the awareness of themselves, like where do they come from and why are they writing? Are they writing just as a reaction to what happened to them in the recent past, or are they trying to properly build the foundations for a national consideration about their people's history, etc.? These are like, there are massive divides, and this is what has been sort of hidden in the public discourse, even in the European Union, that so like that didn't want, nor the left nor the right wanted to properly point out the radical differences that exist in terms, especially after the end of the the Cold War, in the political, cultural, developmental path of different parts of Europe, right? And that have been, from one side, seen as we don't have to point it out. We should give just opportunities with nothing back, lots of money, because we have to put them at our own same pace. Or from the right, no, this, we should use actually that better national socialism as actually, during the same Cold War, like in the Warsaw Pact, it was also the only way to make the thing go on. Like most of what the alleged conservatism from the most reactionary countries that flirt with Russia or think that the EU is just trances and green or whatever, that factually isn't, right? To be extremely fair, that the problem is in the media is, of course, what is prospected and for what, and it's never what you actually see. And yes, there are shady deals behind that. We're all disgusted by that sort of degeneration. But it has none of the people that actually say, the overwhelming majority of the people who actually protest this or take the nominal stand, and eventually they don't do anything, because you can immediately see that there's not even a remote chance that anything is going to change violently or subversively. That it stems only from that same sort of communistic paranoia. It's pure communism. It has nothing to do with tradition, with European identity, or whatever. That at best works just when you want to. That's the only thing it works with to counter immigration in the first place. That is not even just to say illegal immigration. It's actual immigration, at least in the way it's being projected. And on that, I'm actually in, right on that train. For the rest, and I talk to these people often, like it's just pure, first of all, total ignorance about what Europe and Europeans actually are. Cross out the EU. Right, it's literally that these people have never known, as a people, what the hell existed like 10 meters outside wherever they are. They're radically underschooled, dramatically, weak, fragile, psychologically speaking. I mean, post-Soviet trauma is a thing. Like, we should be paying an enormous amount, probably even medical resources, to fix these people's brains, because what happens to you after socialism, it's not normal, right? This is designed to take away humanity from people surgically and methodically. These are not things that you recover from after 2-3 generations. There are those people who say, but this country is not communist anymore because, look, it's not the Soviet Union. It doesn't mean shit, right? These people have been brutally traumatized, denaturated of any trace, again, of cultural, moral, personal value, because the intrinsic point of Marxism is that you must erase any trace of that, not to think anyone to be able to do anything competitively and just obeying like animals to anything you teach them to do. This is the only objective of communism. Again, these people have not been magically re-educated, right? They are not magically intelligent. They're not magically bright. They're not magically educated. They're not magically knowledgeable. They're not magically capable, productive. They don't make children. They are actually plenty of immigrants themselves. Their states are disaster. And the only way, say, that the only divide between those who work and those who don't is actually the ones that have been more successfully supported and subsumed by the broader West, a process that they also have, because the elite are, of course, more intelligent. They have done voluntarily, contrary to the idea. NATO expanded that's a free choice, in case you didn't notice, by the way. And if you think otherwise, I would start checking the background that I'm describing right now, in case anybody did not. We all see it through. Remember that. If you are from there, everybody sees that. Like you do not fake it with historical fantasy, with some strange sense of masking your own inferiority complex, your shame. Everybody sees that, right? It's crystalline in the mind of a true Westerner. And some are successful, some aren't, right? And when you see what happened, like, say, the interesting aspect of this all is that the more you go out of the West and the more this trend follows. Like, it's not that you can ascribe, because that's also the view behind that every country is equally different and special, and whoever wants to, who does say that according to you? Of course, a person that cannot afford to be evaluated, but because through evaluation, everybody knows what would happen, right? There is a rigid hierarchy of cultural superiority and inferiority. And all what these people are trying to distract you from is exactly that. Right, the myth that the West is sick, is rotten, is broken, no. Right, we're the people who live best in the world. There is no indicator that is telling us that even the rest of, the BRICS are going to go beyond a certain threshold that surely is eroding, like what the West has previously been able to control on a global basis, but that is not able to, it's going to enter an impasse much earlier, much worse than the West is going through right now. And the indicators are exactly the same, except they're much worsened by lots of other factors, and in fact have never been solved. So in a world like this, you cannot really mask the differences that also historically occurred in Eurasia to make the world the one it is. Right? In the West, we have, let's say, lots of people have this other sort of mental illness for which they believe that everything changed with the Enlightenment, right? And that if we took off at that point, it's not because, say, there was a pregress moral, combination that allowed our potential to explode and take over the world. A world that is being raised exclusively through Western models. Like, there is nothing else out there. Every single country out there, especially if you think about China, through the same Marxism, and it's all like a Western thing. I'm not going to discuss why that happened as well, but the mythology is that this happened essentially because of an anti-traditional idea, right? The moment we started to bail out from God, from religion, from essentially the entire package as such, not the way it was calibrated, which, for the sclerotization of the Ancien regime may even be the actual thing. Otherwise, it would have not collapsed, right? There is a broader sense of erosion of the world that is accepted by all traditional cultures. It's a universal thing. But it's only after the nationalistic and or socialistic revolutions of the 18th, of the 19th, of the 20th century that this rhetoric has actually come in, right? There are some, of course, of these systems that manage to successfully re-equilibrate themselves. I think that in Europe, also thanks to, say, the U.S. intervention, the British, the Anglo-American intervention during World War II was re-equilibrated, because common law, after all, was and is founded on some very traditional principles that continental Europe had started to go astray from, indeed, in the age of fascism, of communism. And there is, even if, of course, in especially fascism, there actually is some trace of reevaluation of traditional bases. These are completely separated from the notion that you must actually be able to mix the Apollonian and the Dionysian, must be founded on the universal and imperial Catholic realization that if things went downhill for millennia, and you think that the basis from which this reactivation the inversion of the trend could occur starts from essentially a fatalistic post-traditional ideology like nationalism and or socialism actually is. And here, of course, I'm referring to National Socialism, but also fascism in general. Well, you have not understood what the problem is. That the same people that you're trying to pretend to be the master race are actually just a pile of garbage because of a process that you cannot change in the span of a couple of generations, right? You could, if, of course, you were also, like, you see, the supreme test of fascism was war, right? Because they hadn't identified correctly that that's the ground in which, in the devastating way we have seen, you could, in theory, cause a change to restore a certain order. But skipping the strict ideologies, let's say, for example, the fear against the Jews is, I can't think how that can be a traditional idea, right? If you feel threatened by someone else, in tradition, you're automatically inferior, right? That's how it starts all from. So, of course, there was a lot of relativism all around, and in part connected exactly with this incapacity to see the real order of the world in that interplay, right? There were strategic reasons why, say, the Nazis flirted with other, for example, with the Arabs, right? With say there is we can't digress on it now, also because I would be banned from YouTube probably, but not really. I would be able to talk about it. It's not an issue, but I mean the level of alienation of the transfigurational possibility, the fact that you should simply immediately destroy everything just to rebuild. Like, what are your bases, right? Because by the 19th century, by the 20th century, no people in the world had macroscopically and self-evidently, as a people, as a single nation, let's say, the capacity, the quality, the inherent quality, beauty, intelligence, strength, capacity of remolding the world through the Imperial Evangelion. There wasn't, right? You must take like a massive, a radical reacculturation and re-spiritualization of the world that, just if you read the Mein Kampf, it's just not completely non-existent in the minds of these makers. So it's and it could not be accepted because they were seeing themselves, of course, in their own failure, right? For example, also during World War I, of course, their own inferiority that was reconfirmed with the defeat in World War II. You can be taken down also by mass, right? This is not to say that the Soviet Union. Let's from one side leave the political indoctrination aside, like it was qualitatively, but not even remotely superior to, say, Germany as a civilization. Absolutely not, right? It's the same reason why, I don't know, Poland was knocked out by the Germans. Things could have gone otherwise, but yes, kind of Germany was more advanced. So we, unfortunately, made the mistake after World War II of seeing the world in, okay, whatever those guys were thinking was crazy and insane and bad, and so we will never even think to reapproach tradition the right way. First of all, because we do not know what it is, right? And this is actually the point, and this is why actually I have fun with my content, because in large part it is traditional, but I still have to sort of to play to use the big guns here, and it makes that kind of especially like Marxistic, like as it affirmed culturally in university, sort of the screen of this alleged cultural alternative or whatever that was supposed to mean. That of course is just a joke, right? It's of course by definition even more nonsensical than as we were saying before, the right say that, because we shouldn't confuse the fact that at the end of the day most fascism is socialistic in matrix, right? There is no doubt about that, and not just definitionally in certain movements. but I will have to make so many videos about the 20th century to really arrive to that point. So the point I was actually making, you would wonder why I was about this, is that the sense that there can be simply a dialogue between, let's say, that there can be a hope to wait for other parts of the world to discover this. The idea that we have to work together, whatever, is very naive, right? What should happen, in my opinion, is that the West should start seriously relooking at its roots and acknowledging this level of fall, not just the temporary sort of crisis that is very mild compared to lots of other things that happened even some decades ago, and talking about the millennial one, and starting from the history, in fact, of these empires, and starting to evaluate comparatively and diachronically what happened in the world and why, and what kind of measure, what kind of consistency exists in among these different populations. What I was saying before actually is that when you come down, I made a video in which I explained this a little bit. That is a Q&A, I think. What is the West? It's from some couple of years ago. Today I would probably phrase it differently, but the traditional doctrine of struggle and victory, and essentially the elimination of fear, the boundless self-actualizational spiritual capacity and more, is reflected in the confidence of civilizations. These are all fallen, right? We have just the mythology telling us, essentially, in a theological sense, what was going on at a certain point. But then you realize that we all sort of failed in different ways, but there is, of course, a different hierarchy in the process, and there is no doubt that the West is the one that achieved it the greatest, right, in terms of, like, first of all, the Roman Empire. That truly is the empire prophesized restoring the golden age in between the two last eras, right, between the Bronze and the Iron one. I made lots of videos about Roman religion in that regard, and the a bit more empiricistic base, which is in fact also a bit the mark of Anglo-Saxon culture, that took over the world in the last couple of 100 years. There would be more, telling the truth. We could start from Alexander. That would be sort of better. But today we do not look at that. Today we try to make this effort of realizing, also as I show in other videos, how the outer you fall of this self-actualizational say measure of spirit, and the more like these people sort of look similar to each other. Meaning what? That, as I was saying before, if you fall out of that Westernness narrowly meant, as we came to evaluate it conventionally in a word, you realize that it's not like there is just a diversity from the West. So say, I don't know, Russia is in a certain way, let's say, and then China is in a certain way, and these are two different things that are not like the West, right? They actually start looking more alike, and this is because, of course, they are lower, and they go towards a lower standard that, of course, doesn't match the higher one, and so they kind of look more alike. I wouldn't like to make specific. I consider Russia actually a Western country in this sense. I say Western. I could try to talk about the Western cycle and in a metaphysical way, but say I'm using the term Western in the modern sense to be more understandable. They are, right? They are, say, barely Christian, for example, and notoriously Ukraine is a much more Christian country than Russia. They are, as I was saying before, they don't make children. They get a lot of immigrants. They have this enormous burden of like lack of properly objective morality. Like, I don't know if you ever talked with a Russian and asked them, like, it seems to me that the single thing they're phobic the most is the idea that there is an objective truth. It's as if they had, every single person I've ever talked to from there, they immediately got hysterical at the idea. They began to feel threatened. They begin to be paranoid. This is something I honestly never met in the West. I mean, just among the weaker people, like the more mentally fragile. But sort of here, it's an accepted idea. I mean, it's been coming with the Marxist nonsense about safe spaces, all that sort of, it's whatever I invent that has to be like I want and others have to obey with it. That's just largely a mental illness, as a matter of fact. And I didn't know this, right? At the beginning, I was fed. I was born and raised here. I had an idea that, yes, other countries are different, but you can't sort of talk like, you can't understand each other. They have sort of the same moral balance. They're like the same like you. They're mentally stable. They're confident. They're assertive. They are, they're projected towards success, achievement, conquest, beauty, intelligence. Hell no. Right? There is a sense of stagnation, of weakness, and this depends on the different cultures that you encounter. It's not to say that I don't want to be. It's not even say when that I of course I support Ukraine. I've always been open about it, but it's not that I hate Russia in the sense that I don't have. I have had historically in my life an interest in Russia. I have like some books of a shelf of my library dedicated to the Russian classics. I studied Russian history. I got interested. I know Russian people who are opposed to Putin's regime and that are pretty miserable about that without being leftists or whatever. That's the lie of it, that you have to be a leftist to go against that order. Like, it's just a nonsense that exists in the West, by the way. No Russian believes that, right? Also because they do not really know how it's here. They've never told that they don't understand that. They're not programmed to think that, right? It's from one commendable side, like something that doesn't interest them, but it's just like what comes with the lack of awareness that of the totality of what that is. Also beyond with other countries, that is embarrassing, right? For example, it's typical of Russians to say that, I don't know, there are some poor backward countries that are, they're so beautiful places. I wouldn't like to make specific names, because the example I'm just revolving around is, speaking about specific countries in Europe, see how they dilute towards, say, the Near East, even just geographically. And when you talk with them, it's like you can perceive that they start losing what you felt about your own home, and you start seeing more hubris, more like all this stereotype of barbarism that the West at some point pushed even too far in a sense. As you know, Schwerpunkt I cover, as I was saying before, and as we've seen here, the history of basically at least most of Eurasia, because that's what I've been covering. And of course, you meet the positive, you meet the noble, you meet the moral, whatever, the traditional cultures. But I also truly believe that there is a special combination of values that only the West had historically, that simply made it more successful at some point. So it's extremely difficult for me to talk about this topic, and you know that I make this huge intros to properly set the ground, because it's not clear at all. Like, if you come from the first time on this channel without years old sort of initiation to this content to understand where I stand, because I honestly don't know anyone who... I know people who believe part of these things, but I don't know anyone who sort of combines them the way I do. And so it takes an awfully long lot of time, right, to explain things that are sadly not intuitive to most. That's the thing that disappoints me most, because if this is the realization I start from when I think tradition, that 100 years ago, to some people it would have been immediately clear what I'm talking about. it's in like today, the people who pretend to be conservative. Let's not even talk about the liberals, who are good liberal people, that sometimes you don't have these problems. We'd always remember that if, say, your liberal side of the aisle sucks, the conservative side of the aisle sucks as well. Like, it's not, you can't see the merit in the intrinsic superiority of conservatism, in its closeness to tradition, but it's so like irrelevant in the actual manifestation of what the masses are actually about, that most conservatives today are essentially radical leftists for 300 years ago standards, and they don't even know that. Right? They think that if they went back then, that's not even to say 500, 1,000 years ago, like everybody would pat them on their shoulders, whereas they probably would, burn them at stake. That's maybe too extreme as a concept, but surely they would have been hopeless weirdos emarginated from society in a world that, of course, they are incapable themselves to understand, also because they've never studied it. Because, let's be honest, nobody studies history in our world in a serious sense. So, I've been planning to make 2 videos. One was inspired to, I don't know if you know that the Italian fascist mystic Evola, who defined, it's an impressive definition, the spread of Christianity as the syncope of Western civilization or something along that line, with which I thoroughly disagree. And he corrected himself about once, because the fascist mystics often resumed just that, in fact, which is also adopted by the fascists in general, like that sort of let's kill Christ, and let's resume, say, Odin, and let's start massacring people, which is basically what the Nazis start doing in practice, and failed, in case you didn't notice, and just making leverage, as we were saying before, in that sort of cheap, say what Clausewitz would identify with the primordial hatred of the masses, right? Nothing that has to do with the traditional trinity, in fact, of like present in all the Indo-European Evangelion, of the political rationale, of the military gamble, in fact, the primordial hatred of the people, but blended together in a perfect synthesis, right? I'm talking Nazism here very lightly here, but the point I was making is that Evola explained it at some point very clearly, because he was disappointed at this other sort of younger, in fact, ever less traditional, but they thought to be traditional. That's the sad part of the story. The fascist mystics that Christianity is not like, let's leave aside the concept of being positive or negative. It's not the cause of what happened back in the day, morally speaking, when we think about the collapse of the Roman Empire. It's the consequence of a pregressed status of mankind, which is, as we've seen, the one of constant decline. Right, the reason why Christianity spread, to make the long story short, is that it had to make people reactivate a different type of spirituality based on the, not on the sort of deterministic, materialistic, and superstitious and cultic attitude that had spread among the masses at the time already, regarding sacrifice to a guy who lived without achieving particular miracles, by the way, in an empire that was collapsing, and that was the entire glue of that state. But going so beyond, aesthetically speaking, to try to recover that pure spiritual power, that if you have ever studied or simply read a geography, Christian geography, is all what the deal is about. I made lots of videos explaining how there is a direct continuity between the martial military violence and that necessity of regeneration. This is exactly what happened with Buddha, that far from being a pacifist was actually, as you know, one of the, belonged to the Vedic military caste. The same thing about great names in the West, like Saint Martin of Tours, that everybody tells you, oh, Saint Martin, the saint. Yes, little detail, like he belonged to the, he was a soldier of the Schole Palatine of Julian, right? And I don't know if you have an idea what those people did for a living. This sense of the idea that there was a moral exhaustion is perfectly real And the reason why there are so many people that hate Christianity to some degree is that they believe that which is also a completely anti-traditional declaration, I'd say, of ignorance, that, up to Christianity everything was fine, and inexplicably somebody decided to change religion and everything collapsed. Maybe it's not humanity that is already fallen, mortal, whatever. It was already in that, by scale, at that level of misery, and that was, as all the traditional cultures say, from the Norse to the Roman, to it is simply descending, degrading, as the same Christianity itself, which is just a continuation of the Catholic, religion, universal Catholic. That's what it means, actually. Religion actually says that Satan has to come to rule on earth, right? There is to be the storming of the Asgard, the age of the wolf, at some point. Well, this has been completely ignored. Guess why? Because 19th century, 20th century demagogues began to convince the average person that there is nothing wrong in them as human beings. And that's where the disaster occurred. And we're witnessing actually yet another civilizational disaster, for which we will have to, hopefully not, but if the worst happens, let's say, to atone for it once again. And Christianity was just a step in the actually pretty honest and objective realization of what mankind had come to, for which God himself had to provide with this, model boost. It sounds very, lame to explain, say, Christ's come like that, but, and making people aware of the superiority of spiritual force over, before any material manifestation. It is not to say that material manifestation doesn't come through that power, but it can't be based just on a sclerotic vestige. It must be constantly revived, right? Replenished to make things work. The way, again, the word became Christian largely, and or this also overlapped essentially with the Western expansion in the world, I would think is extremely telling of the actual power of this formula, even if still in this stage of human fall. Then eventually, this is the same with the church. Like if the church is made, by humans that are grouped under, the Holy Ghost, in the Holy Ghost, as it. Now I can't explain it doctrinally, but this was the same, again, understood since ever, like this thing that the universal Catholic belief existing from millennia. They are degenerating themselves as sinners. Of course, there is going to be a collapse in standards. There are going to be Christians that are not Christians anymore, that do not understand the point of it anymore. There are going to be people who, of course, if Christians do not understand the point anymore, they're going to understand even less of that, and so they think that Christianity was a problem. They don't see the cause-effect relations orderly. They don't see what the world came to be and why, what for, and they think that they are so special, except they are failures of human beings, because I don't know anybody who has taken over the world and transfigured divinely the same currently, or is close to any level of human standard that is capable to achieve that, right? Even though we do have all the potential as long as we are alive, right? And even beyond, when you think that it's all still part of a providential concept. So this is one side, like in the crisis of the Roman Empire, as far as the West is concerned, and as far as we will see now also in parallel, it was occurring to everyone, right? Also the Norse began to stop thinking that, say, a human could make it alone, right? The later sagas, it's not that they are because they are transcribed in Christian times, that they were transcribed in the way they were actually told, and by that point they did not think really that, they say there is an incumbent idea of fate that overwhelms the hero after all. This was something very old in time, actually. It existed already at this point. It's during the migration era that the the age of heroes had been passed. The same is for the collapse, as we will see, of the Indian Empire, the Chinese one. And through this dynamic, which is pretty similar, it's the usual idea that civilizations are reinvigorated, injected in the case of the West, and possibly also for most of the rest of Eurasia. It was because of the Indo-European migration, some people say, and it's not really at all implausible, that the same Chinese empire was founded by Indo-Europeans originally. I mean, the time is that one. We know that the war chariot was spreading everywhere, that it was a very pervasive phenomenon. Look at the history of the Middle East, how many of those peoples were actually like Germanized by the Indo-Aryan elite and beyond. But once, and these are, we know that we're carriers of this, like in our language, we still speak Indo-European. You still believe that the same cultural representation are the same. Doesn't matter how modernistically and secularistically they are represented. That's how we think still, we behave, and more. The 19th century reactivated, for example, like, okay, let's skip this aspect. I mean, the way eventually people thought of the world today is some sort of strange picture in which, I don't know, the Romans were anti-traditional, and say the good old barbarians of the north were the great carriers of this. No, in tradition it doesn't work like that. You know, the most blessed were exactly the southern conquerors, as you can see in Dorian mythology, like the single most violently concrete sense of the crystal unchangeable order of the superiority of the conquerors was the one in the Hellenic invaders, right? In the sense of Delphi becoming properly the Omphalos of the world, like the greatness of the hero, especially, that truly manages to achieve transcendence, is much more pronounced in that culture than in any other one. So because the better conquerors had taken the best part. There's not really a way you can put it different. It's also different reasons in terms of chronology, the way they're documented or not. Think about the Vedas, right? And the fact that we don't even have an archaeological trace of them, but their impact was so radical that still, like, Hinduism bears trace of the entire deal, even if it is filtered from an atrociously long time of actual degeneration, because that was also, like, evidently hell of a shot. Like, that's why say Alexander or Augustus wanted to conquer India themselves at some point. In any case, the problem lays in the relation, in the interpretation, I would say, when we speak in historical terms, between the sedentary and the nomadic world, right? The idea is that these civilizations, even if permeated by these noble ideals, at some point enter in crisis and somebody else manages to take them over. This is only partially true when you look at the story, because at the end of the day, aside from specific people's movements, it's never like a mass one that radically alters the ethnic background of the local communities that also remain quite powerful, especially if you're looking at the migration era, right? The outer world also remains fundamentally backwards. It's more like we're so desperate we have to save ourselves from this general collapse, from this general awareness that there is no ruler that can truly save us, even for us just living at the outskirts of this system. This had been the case for many Germans, for many Iranians, right, in terms of the relation with the Roman Empire, right? And so the idea, we want to participate to that, but even more, is a sabotaging one. It's the idea that is reflected in part also by Arianism, as opposed to Catholicism, unsurprisingly, and that I have cultivated with an ever clearer conviction of this, of wanting to sabotage the human endeavor. It's exactly the same thing that happened during the Protestant Reformation, right? It's the idea is that paradoxically, as we were saying before, it's not the Romans that thought that divinity couldn't be achieved. It was exactly the Arians who said, no, Christ is something separated, after all, from that level of divinity. There is an hypostatic separation by the two things. There is something much more just human in him, and he's not really God himself. And the reason why that happens is the same concept of standards I was talking about before. You do not want others to achieve the highest thing, especially when they are failing in doing so, and you see an opportunity, a window to take their place. Right? This is still the narrative, for example, that is used today by, again, the idea that the world has to be, again, multilateral, that the West cannot decide things. Like, there is an order of things. If somebody's stronger, and commands over others, it's because others are letting them do. Because the intrinsic moral spirituality is potentially able to take over the entire world, even just with a thought, right? If this has happened, it's because the objective moral divides were those ones. The forces constantly intertwining each other in the world, in the universe, were bringing that order, right? And that order is still here fundamentally. It can be eroded, can shrink. This is absolutely the case in times of crisis, right? This is not just the migration era. I see it, I insist, as you know, much on it during talking about the 14th century. But in all these moments of crisis, it's just like civilization, actually, that the more stable systems that eventually keep going on, right? And in order to have a shift proper, you have to wait for times in which, if anything, in the broader civilization, there are areas that are less competitive than others for different reasons, but the same dynamic. But hardly you can find a ultra-developed place in the world that was the center of an enormous empire that today is completely devoid of some traces of that, right? Some trace of, at least, of absolute power that, in the case of the West, is actually instead a matter of quality, because Westerners remained, and I will explain this, that is extremely important, also in their own ecumenic recognition, right, and of each other, largely federated, right, largely, maintaining the strength of their own identities in order to reactivate at some point different empires. It's difficult in the history of Europe to pick a country that exists today that at some point in history wasn't really the first of something. Right, it's very, very rare, right? Even smaller countries at some point really had their moment of peak for other reasons. And this is utterly insane. This is not actually something that you can't... this is a first aspect of the wall. Like, you can't say that this happened anywhere else in the world, right? The other systems are bigger, which means that in a quantitative sense, there were more people under somebody else. This is typical of China, versus, say, the Roman Empire, that even in the erosion of civic values or power, like, was an incredibly more civic reality, like, than China at any point. And so that also the West derived an enormous sense of how important the individual is to reactivate that, Catholic power from the within. And you don't have that. Like, you don't have if you pick at the great, say, Egypt, Persia, India, China, you have within them, yes, different areas, but that were never so well sort of outlined, like you can see already certain countries were since antiquity, right, in terms of regional power in Europe, right? Especially when you look at Western Europe, it's all well enucleated, like Britain, Gaul, Spain, Italy, Germany too, to a certain extent. These are the countries that, to a large degree of, positive categorical identification, have continued, right, till to this very day. and that have all at some point reached some level of world dominance. Literally all of them, right? This is not something you can say about, say, Korea, right? Or certain parts of China or India. Or you can see in the Middle East one specific, say, country that at some point, say, yes, Iran is one of them in an original sense, but within them there aren't other sort of states that at some point were so actively competing with one another that expanded from another basis of a country that still exists, right? Also, most of the countries, in fact, that exist today in the Middle East were traced by, say, geographically by Europeans, of course, on the basis of some progressed identification, but with much less dynamic and functional stories than, in fact, single European countries had been having from quite a while, even way before colonialism, right? We're talking the Middle Ages, to say the least, or before, right? This is extremely important, right? The degree the European has maintained a greater sense of his individual power is reflected by how the frontier with the West has been, for example, much less, in fact, capable of rising in the first place, because the West never lost that power, right? This is an aspect we observe very often, that it doesn't matter how many waves of conquerors arrive from the steppes. This is valid actually for other sedentary peoples, right? But this world never fully collapsed, right? This is, in fact, the interesting degree of comparison I want to make today between the Romans, the Guptas, and the Hans. Because the Indian Empire was actually destroyed by the Hans, right? China was actually exploding at some point in its history. Yes, Europe did too. This is true. But the degree of compactness that the individual chunks that sort of had already existed and still maintained the control, the contact and the awareness, for example, the Roman Empire, through Constantinople, but almost immediately, in a sense, even without discontinuity with the so-called Holy Roman Empire in the early days, is yet another part of the story that has not been emphasized adequately, right? A part of the anti-traditional narrative that you're fed still in schools and universities is that basically it's the legalistic, it's something emerging like a concept of state and culture from multiculturalism, mostly in the 1970s, and it's the idea that there are fixed, rigid categories. Remember when people made those distinctions? That there is an orthodox, and I remember the name of that guy. There is an orthodox world, and there is this does not apply to the morals and scientific criteria of historical method and research, right? You have to think into a spiritual sense. There is not a fixed, categorical, encyclopedistic bad side of the Enlightenment way to sort of pretend that there is a static reality, and that things do not continuously evolve. And there is at the same time a way to see a continuity, even of millennia old, that is also being denied to you within those same countries, right? This is true for Europe, interestingly enough, as for any other country, telling you to a degree, but again, Europe maintained this unity in diversity that is also actually, I don't know how much I think like those who created the motto for the EU were seeing it right in that sense, maybe not exactly for the reasons we would like to, but I don't know how much they would see like the identity of some of these chunks. It's not even to say that you have to make the point that literally, I don't know, Clovis Francia was literally France, right? Or because it wasn't, evidently, like, or that, I don't know, Charlemagne was German, or this kind of stuff of that, there are so many other different examples from this that, of course, by degree show all the complexity of and nuance, like sort of development of these identities, but that also, even in those movements of peoples I were saying before, do represent some important recurrence in history. And I don't Like I specialize in the Holy Roman Empire during the 14th century, and in that, for example, spread of German mercenary companies during the crisis of universalism, in the mid 14th century crisis. You can't unsee like some continuation of the migration era, what the German youth used to do, saying, in not just during the migration era, but even in Tacitus times, and why Germany, and why in that order, and why in the continuity with certain Italian power or French. But it's all something that must be properly contextualized, and you must point out the differences with, but there is also an incredible continuity. So the decline of the unitary order of the Mediterranean era, this is a huge deal, right? Because essentially, even as a concept of Middle Ages, we start talking history like that. The sense is the Middle Ages was not like an age, in fact, worth being mentioned, because it had followed the destruction of the Catholic imperial unity. That was the greatest tragedy in the history of mankind, without any trace of remote comparison. And the interesting aspect about this, that even though you're usually told that it's just the humanists who began to tell the story because they were obsessed with the classics for some strange reason that they don't explain you, and that began to say that everybody was a barbarian back in the day, and that the Middle Ages were dark, etc. It's actually not, true at all, right? That, first of all, this was just a unitary vision of what had happened, or what they thought of the Middle Ages, actually, and I made multiple videos on the Renaissance explaining what the traditional meaning of that actually was. But first and foremost, for anyone who has studied just even medieval literature, the same medievals were radically aware of what had happened, right? The entire history of knighthood, of the Renovatio Imperii, of the Guelph-Ghibelline struggle, has its roots at the center of this realization. It is true that by especially the 14th century, with yet another crisis, and yet, in fact, this other step in the disgregation of universalism with the rise of national monarchies, this kind of things, the opening to modernity, let's so can say, it seems like that those people had largely forgotten what had happened. They at least wouldn't rationalize that. They wouldn't have apparently even the tools to reflect systematically on it. But aside from the fact that there were occult currents that still were incredibly aware of what the entire deal really was, they lived well into the Renaissance. Indeed, it was not like the church was completely aware of that the general necessity of the empire was also like a internationally, publicly recognized necessity. Nobody could have really thought otherwise, right? Nobody had put ever that into discussion until, for example, the Reformation was also like ambiguous, telling the truth, the role of the empire, right? It wasn't just about the church. It was also about who does have to rule. It's just in a modern sense that we began to say, oh look, at some point, especially countries like the Netherlands or England began to take off, and since these are the cradle of true modernity and Western, primacy today, like let's pose our attention on, let's put an emphasis on the positivity of what had happened, also in terms of the Protestant narrative, etc., and fueling even more that sense of anti-tradition. And letting, in fact, also these people, sadly enough, like unaware of what, in fact, the sin was, but paradoxically, also exactly because of that loss of traditional awareness, making these the centers that today feel the most this made-up, self-sabotaging guilt, right? That communists would like to make you feel towards our own civilization, instead of being, as everybody is, and I surely am, overwhelmingly proud under every point of view. in a metaphysical sense, right? Which is the thing that you should concern yourself with, rather, right? The ways also history tried to go around the fact that there was this major collapse in the fall of the empire, or at least in the dramatic shrinking of the same, not the end, right? That wouldn't happen until Napoleon. And even Napoleon actually founded another idea of empire and power, and is also, as in that sense, not much the cause but the consequence of a depletion of values, right? So don't speak ill just of Napoleon because you want to make the sort of intellectual, from the Burkean, the guy that says, oh no, I come from another, say, cultural, juridical background, and Napoleon was just a monster. No, right? There was, some of the most rigid proponents of traditionalism, maybe being weak indeed in that way, but even as far as the Tsar of Russia, actually calling the guy, famously enough, after Austerlitz, a man sent from heaven, quite meaningfully enough. And the narrative that, especially in the last decades of inexplicably large publishing of everything late antique connected, mostly because it's the sort of the favorite part of multiculturalism, and in a sense that late sort of Hellenistic world was reflecting it in some fashion, with a pinch of also, contempt towards Christianity, or at least like rationalization's exercise about it. Wanted to make you believe, after all, this was a gradual fall. Like, they didn't really understand it. Oh, come on, after all, so much remained as it was. Now, this is true when you look at the gloomiest sort of idea that some people have of the Middle Ages in general, because late antiquity ends at some point, and these people don't have much the courage to get about the actual fact that the Middle Ages was a hell of a civilization that in many ways was as advanced as, not surpassing different levels, the same ancient ones. But taking away the attention from the strictly political and military meaning of the Catholic Empire, meaning that the universal unity of command is not something that some people were searching for strange purposes of megalomaniac tendencies by some sort of corrupted politician, right? That was the purpose of every single people that existed, as far as, I'm the strongest, I am blessed by God by taking over. Like the weakest, stinkiest tribe at the edge of the world was thinking the same thing that Roman emperors made all their lives about. And in fact, this is also how the aforementioned divides between certain views of power were revolving around. It's not that they were saying, no, you shouldn't attack us because everybody should live peaceful and free. This notion did not exist. If you had said something like this to anyone, including a Buddhist or a Christian, actually, like they would have absolutely looked at you and said, what the hell does that even mean, right? The Catholic condition cannot make you be but under a sacred king in the first place. The difference was in whether we make it to save ourselves with our means, of course in consonance with God, with the Holy Ghost, that is obviously the imperial ego, the naked, the Filzia, the transfigured soul, or not. That was the only divide, right? And if you think about it, nobody today thinks about this. They sort of exorcise death. They mask it. They hide it. The fact that you're mortal, that you're going to die in pain, that this whole thing has you don't know even how you are alive and what a hell of a miracle this is, let's rationalize it in a materialistic, deterministic way. Let's only talk about numbers and stats, and let's say that if something is not demonstrated, by definition cannot exist, even though everything that is not yet demonstrated scientifically exists before it is demonstrated. Of course, does not mean that there are things that you just found on nothing, right? But given that we have our own limitations and we're exactly striving to surpass them, right? That premise is not really very helpful. To boost, in fact, this is the ultimate goal of it all, of the sabotation of life, right? Of mankind. Don't let mankind be aware of what power they have, right? Don't give them any reference to the reality, the objectivity of transcendental power. Because if you do so, like, you will create just another person that will succeed, and you're just scared of that, to the point that you prefer even to be lost, not to be saved in the transfigurational process. And because after all, you don't see it, you don't even know it exists, right? It's terrifying, right? You can read at least there has been a way of reading the end of these major empires of antiquity through the plurimillenary process of stabilization of those populations operating in Eurasia, and that had been contrasting with one another. This is true in the political, military, let's say, evenemential sense of the story. But this is exactly what the aforementioned late antique sort of historiography of the last tens of years that spread because it basically felt like, for the temper of the time, to be belonging a bit in that sort of late antique, stagnating, a bit decadent, but still materially magnific time. And that, of course, as all structuralistic and socialistically inspired, even unintentionally so, by people who were at this point raised in a time in which the professors who taught history reasoned like that, and they influenced them, and they didn't make them even aware that tradition was a thing. This costs itself from anything political, military, and evenemential in the first place, right? So as a Clausewitzian and a military historian, that's something that doesn't quite work on me. I got the antidote, so sorry. And the most important thing, however, is obviously, of course, integrating both, right? Just like in whole honesty, like the early structuralists that opened the way also to those the generations were people that were not rebelling to evenemential history in the sense of denial, but just as a reaction to the fact that, for example, social studies did not quite exist at the time as much, and since most history was military, political, in the wake of nationalistic ideologies, these socialists that reflected that same level of anti-universal decadence, just they transposed it from a political to a social point of view, were complaining against. That's how also National Socialism is born in many ways in terms of, say, currents of philosophy of history, right? So actually studying the history of the migration era and migration era warfare, and I have a pretty hefty playlist for anyone interested, is quite enlightening of these kind of phenomena, and especially on how much, of course, this fall had nothing to do with the idea of the fall of like a territorial state as we think that empires are in a truly, I don't know, Victorian 19th century, like in that sense of, different colored blobs on the map that tells you that is the categorically and unchangeable thing that we should think about. Size and extension, names, colors, flags. That's it. It never changes, right? A complete separation from transcendence and Imperial Catholic tradition. So the sort of the leftistic side of the story skipped that. It is not to say that this wasn't important or undramatic, but the main problem with that wasn't in fact that amount of dirt that a power can claim to fix a flag on. Human means dirty, by the way, and etymologically, as you know, and there's a very specific reason why it does, right? If you want to understand what original sin is, right, not just in the Bible, but in every other single mythology, like perhaps you would start understanding many things about yourself and the world you live in, was primarily seen as you failed. In fact, you sinned. You were not morally fit, right? You were, in a political sense, not, because that's how politics works. It's this geist that lives in the we're programmed genetically to feel, right? To measure. It's not a. You see, that's the beauty of traditional, science and spirituality. We deal with moral forces that you cannot quantify in a laboratory, right? And still life happens, and the most important things, like, these civilizations and wars, etc., are all based on these moral forces. That's literally the single most important thing. And the reason why we study them in a certain way is exactly because you can't reduce it to a mathematical formula, right? What mattered in this sense was realizing a dramatic crack that, in that sense, I think that Evola had his own reasons to call it the syncope of Western civilization, in the failure of that sacred monarch to be an effective medium of the divinity. This is what in all traditional cultures the secular and religious ruler was all at once, right? That's the idea. The emperor was a pontifex. I made a video about sacred royalty, also about the Sol Invictus. That is also a much older thing than also what people think. It was just a strange current in late antiquity. That was the mainstream. I hate the term mainstream, but I'd say the standard Imperial Catholic function of kingship since ever, like throughout all the, Indo-European, non-Indo-European tradition, whatever, it was all there in the same way. And in fact, the people tend to confuse even why, like they think at some point Mithraism was some sort of Oriental cult that was alien to Rome but could substitute itself to Christianity. This is also what Nietzsche believed, right? It was a moron because he confused like literally Mithras with an Eastern decadent thing alien to European identity. Well, it was actually one of the the epitome of the heroes, one of the Dioscuri, of course, of the stemming from the Vedic religion, and that literally tells you how from stone to turn into the sun. And of course, this would be incredibly alive among the soldiers, because the soldiers understood better how that self-sacrifice in holy combat that provides you with salvation is supposed to work. But Christianity won itself exactly because defeats were arriving, because there was a general sense of tiredness, of exhaustion. And Christianity reflects instead on your sins and what can you do to atone for them and to surpass, like to be able to win even without arms, right? But still taking over the world in the process. You cannot deny that Christ succeeded in this as well. And there is a reason why Christendom should be understood as actually a major mover of the superiority of Western civilization from that point onwards. Not that before it hadn't had, again, look at the Romans, and still the other sort of different traditions that survived within Christendom from previous times to make Europe what it is hadn't been affected. But at that point, right, and when they explain you how and why the Europeans conquered the world, they colonized everywhere, etc. They don't tell you, like, look, this was a deeply Christian civilization, what did that mean exactly? All right. No, it must have been because they had guns. It's the all deterministic, technologistic, materialistic distraction from the transcendental side of the story, right? So I made last year a pretty long series about Eurasian steppes warfare that talks exactly the military history and, in fact, characterization of the warfare of the various peoples that confronted themselves in the steppes, not just the nomads, but say I don't know, the Macedons with the Saka, or the Romans with the Sarmatians at Similia, right? So I think I have been speaking long enough about the history of how we can also interpret it to a degree of that immense band of the northern hemisphere, that is the steppes, the Eurasian steppes and their surroundings, right? So the interesting thing about this is that the overwhelming majority of the world population was concentrated in the northern hemisphere, just like next to the steppe was next to this endemic concentration, of course, in a sedentary, fertile, agricultural, statalized dimension, in which the populations distributed practically and entirely in either rural or urban settlements. Of course, in pre-industrial times, the overwhelming majority of the people lived in the countryside. This is true for Rome as for the Middle Ages and so on, independently from the gradual development of the city as the center of the world. Actually, the Middle Ages is much more city oriented, city centered than the Roman one. I mean, the Roman one was controlling most of the empire through the cities, so in relative terms, to a degree, there is a deep importance of that function that is even greater than one of the Middle Ages. But I mean, urbanism was a much bigger deal, so in a demographics, especially in a demographic sense, in medieval time. Today I don't talk about Middle Ages because it would be too much, there are too many comparisons to make, but they all get down to the different degree which these peoples had been organizing themselves as a consequence of this major moral shift that had occurred after the migration era. So these communities, sedentary communities, were coordinated and protected within the territorial frames that were normally in either political expansion or in transformation. And within, social systems that were hierarchically ordered. And we're talking about the great civilizations, again, of the Northern Hemisphere. And these peoples were under the recurrent threat of extraneous populations that belonged to the steppes, provided with more agile, but also weaker systems that were habituated to a persistent collective mobility. In other words, they were nomadic, right? And again, there is no... I talked so many times in the videos about the migration era of how, again, sedentary civilization was the bigger winner, right? That when you realize what happened, in terms, again, of the fall, let's say, the bit too catastrophistic concept of these empires, we're not talking about the destruction of a civilization. Actually, this civilization is the one that resisted the most. Like the groups of peoples that inhabited, that came from the outer side, were eventually absorbed by the civilization, and they weren't even replicating themselves later in the way they had done up to that point. That's often a myth. Your presented like, the primitive was such a better guy. He was always pure and unspoiled. Surely these people were impressive at different levels. They were true warriors and conquerors, and we have seen their magnificence in so many military history videos. But we don't have to forget that the reason why they were is that they were desperate, right? That they lived in a nightmarish reality in which if you were not militarized to that level, you could not survive. And that especially they were seeking at all costs to settle themselves somewhere in this more fertile, sedentary world to enjoy riches that they had never had because the same sedentary civilization had kept them out, right? This is actually the most important point that I wanted to touch today upon. That is to say, the difference between Rome, China, and India as far as this phenomenon and how much these civilizations were impacted by these, say, barbarian conquests. I put them separately in brackets because they are sort of complicated topics that I don't intend to discuss. But we have always seen how at the end of the day, the steppe remained a steppe, and historically was also taken over ultimately by the sedentaries that never died, that may have received blows that look impressive because we are part of that sedentary civilization still. But so it seems upsetting for us that something like the Roman Empire fell, right? And it is. But it didn't fall to that degree for which it's something alien to us that doesn't live within, in this case, the West. Nor the rest of history can be understood otherwise, because this is not, okay, antiquity ends, so the Romans passed the palm of the interesting historical topic to, I don't know, the Germanic tribes, and so now let's make our life, when we study the Middle Ages, just about that. Right, that's yet another enormous problem. That sort of how the Middle Ages are represented. Like people whine all the time because, of course, like I say, the leftists only when they have to show more diversity in the Middle Ages, meaning that they want to implant, irrelevantly present, exotic races into, say, I don't know, 13th century England, for whichever lame and shallow and superficial show that they want to feed you on Netflix, right? Or wherever. Whereas the actual deal that we should reinforce as Europeans, as Westerners, is the aforementioned one of how tough and cool actually all the various segments of Europe really were, because this proportion in which the Middle Ages, for example, is confined to something like, 15th century northwestern Europe, as opposed to, Central Europe, different parts of Southern Europe, because everything is very complex and articulated. Even Scandinavia, Eastern Europe, or the Balkans, but mostly also where literally the majority of the people was concentrated, that is essentially southwestern Europe, and together with the greater civilizational advancements that are at large, like what we see in historic, like with the Roman Empire, right, in the parts that were, in fact, more prosper in Europe since those times, it's sort of appalling, right? And this also, in my opinion, is a sort of socialistic scheme, because if you actually have an idea of our European unity through that difference and how advanced we were collectively and how much you could make your life about studying in depth, as I try to provide you also with the content with, the entirety of Europe, everything would be truly, say, more diverse in the sense that, it's not just concentrating on a single thing, but it isn't, because you are able to give a correct dimension to everything, right? And it's not including the usual bunch of races, by the way, in context that they are usually enforced in this despicable pseudo-cultural representations. It's actually giving dimension to the blood and soul of your own fatherland, because that's how they saw themselves in an imperial way, and they believed in the empire for a long time to come. The Roman Empire was never over, spoiler. And not just because there was something that we call Byzantine Empire out there. It literally wasn't, because it's a metaphysical concept that lived deeply within the same Romano-Germanic Europe to a degree that the hijacking mostly from the sort of pessimistic view of Anglo-Saxon historiography about their own Middle Ages, that objectively, yes, in Britain were in the first couple of centuries of the Middle Ages truly dark ages in the sense that we know too few, but the rest of Europe, Western Europe especially, wasn't like that at all. And so this gets prospectively minimized and shrunk to a degree that it's silly, because it would just be enough to read, I don't know, German, French, or Italian to know how much history we have also written. You must recover a sense of continental European history and culture, because we remained with some standards that are necessary to be held, to be known, to be made your own in a brotherly way. Also, if you belong, say, to the Anglo-Saxon world, and I say this because I know that most of my viewers are from the United States, and I suspect that there is also some sort of tendency from people of European ancestry. If anything, because like I cover, in fact, in great detail the Middle Ages mostly, but not all. Right? I see you like the Romans. I see you like lots of different things actually. So that also about non-European topics, it was very interesting for me to witness in the first place. So the question is, how did this uniqueness survive the migration era in the West, right, compared to other countries that seem to have had a very similar history? So let's pick the Chinese Empire, right? The Great Wall of China. Now, this was built starting from the 3rd century BC, right? Because China had a much greater exposure to the continuous aggressions of the nomads of what is essentially today's Mongolia. And as you know, in spite of the military colonies that were gradually created at the boundaries of China, we will talk about this. I made a video about the Han military organization, so something is explained already there. China had to suffer penetrations and sacks that would translate themselves in the 4th century AD, of course, to the reduction of the empire, the shrinking of the empire, to its southern provinces, right, bordering in the north with these new political territorial creations that were initially of barbarian, footprint, and that, however, were themselves in constant defense under the attack of other hordes coming from the steppes. China is particularly important in this because it's sort of the favorite, competitor with Rome. There is no doubt that the kin, everything under heaven, had historically an enormous relevance in the history of mankind. It was truly also in there an evangelical root at the basis. The problem with China, however, is that it was organized in a very different way from, say, what we see in the Roman Empire, right? Again, the Enlightenment and the sort of statalistic and civilistic attitude, which is sort of, say, state and citizenry are important and good. Everything ending in ism isn't, right? So when you look at the Roman Empire, Greece, it seems as if, the greatness of Europe resided exclusively in the fact that these were apparently republics or democracy, even worse. None of that, right? I can't digress on the topic. I just the other day was making a video about the Italian genetic dominance in the Roman legions and explaining the rights of civitas and connubium. It's also very racially connected, by the way, topic, because It was literally these people ruling over others and disciplining the way their own military that was sacred in terms of bearing the imperium, the cingulum militaris in the exercise of their function, right? And so they couldn't quite mix with during the service with other races, etc. But we will talk about this better also in another video. Just the one I already made is it was a spiritual problem, right? How loyal are you to the ultimate sacrifice that is able to divinely transcend, right? If you look at the history of Europe in a more consistent way, if you look at the origin of the Greeks, of the Romans, their ethnic background, etc., you realize that basically we're talking about something much more livelier, tribal than we think, right? The same Romans, the same Greeks were actually organized in tribes, not just at the beginning, but in their political system. They came from this continental, tough, warlike cultures that had also just been some of the many that had historically arrived at waves from the Indo-European steppes, right, and that had been taken over other areas, like the same Greeks would at some point roam around with their mercenaries in Egypt, talking even before Alexander. Think about the Scythians raiding the Middle East, and like how you can see the Romans coming as northern conquerors across the sea in this sort of almost Wagnerian swan appearance over places like Carthage or Egypt, like this great female praised to gravitate with the imperial virility, right, of this rigidly patriarchal Indo-European stocks, and that warlikeness, that sense of sacrifice, of mystical awakening of in military initiation, in that blend between the Apollonian and the Dionysian hierarchical order, that is reflected exactly by for example, the Macedonian conquests, right, is the actual meaning of Europe, right, in many ways, in the sense that in the background, like the Roman legionaries, we were just saying, was a citizen in arms, which meant not a serf soldier, somebody that would be passively just, working for somebody else, even when poor, but a guy that was elevated by the oligarchic warlords of the so-called Roman Republic to conquer other peoples and win a greater status and land and slaves and settling and taking other people's women and colonizing the world and managing to mold, like to make entire countries speaking their own language, even though they didn't before, is actually the single most impressive aspect of Romanity, right? Not just the stability eventually that followed, the Pax Romana, the impressive, like at that point, the material side of the story, impressive infrastructure you can still see in the beautiful monuments, the aqueducts, the roads, and so on. But properly the force that had generated this, also in a quite primitive but meant in a positive sense way, that we tend to sort of forget routinely when you talk about these topics. Well, to make it a long story short, China was very different from this. There had been more heroic times. All these peoples had undergone similar dimensions, but Chinese society was organized in a much more sclerotic way. The level of oligarchization was really overly pronounced. Like if an Augustus was a primus inter pares among the Roman nobility, like the Chinese emperors had a much more already dynastically, monarchically minded sort of institutionalized order to rest on, right? They say China is also say Europe has some advantages. As you know, I don't believe in geopolitics. I believe it's a complete load of BS. It's not to say, however, that geography does not have an influence. in practice, right? And you understand that Europe is, let's say, is a bit more of an adventure to cross, coming from the west, from the east, from the steppes. You have different boundaries, different climatic zones. You have mountains, rivers, important divides all along, and also for meeting peoples that are still substantially warlike, right, and sort of, in that sense, individually activated for putting up a fight in general. This is how we technically still are. China is much more directly exposed to these Mongolian predators that have a much more directly close and especially large sort of boundless frontier that they can penetrate. This frontier is admittedly very deep, so that there is all a level of strata of, say, civilizational development before you reach properly the great Chinese realities. But this is exactly what makes it less of a, let's say, more unstable as a frontier, right? In Europe, you start having this only from Central Europe, Eastern Europe. For example, already Germany doesn't have a real eastern frontier historically, right? And the steppes begin pretty close there from Hungary, and so it's these are in fact areas. The limit still today of the major European divide in terms of, civilizational development, which is still something that continues in the barbarism of, say, the Soviet Union coming from the East and socialism and all its damage, but it's actually something extremely older, right? Eastern Europe was that sort of backwards, more sparsely populated, less productive, and more from a much older time, right? That you have Central Europe is yet another thing that is a bit better than you find properly. Western Europe is the other thing, and it's not so, especially in Central Europe. Say when look at today, right? The northern countries are actually the more developed, but also in the way the West came to be in a certain way, especially, I insist, as you know, on the let's not digress on this, but I mean, the fact that the Arabs ruled in Spain for 700 years, that's something you want to consider. The fact that the Roman papacy connected itself very, very early on with the Frankish monarchy. This axis between Gaul and Italy is very, 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 very old. The same one with Germany. That makes the whole Roman Empire in the end. So the post-Carolingian Europe and how this expanded in England, in Sicily, in all around, how it managed essentially to win the Western Slavs and Central Europe as a whole. The gradual spread with the Reconquista in Spain, etc. So there are different things that within the system make the saying go. The saying is a bit true for China. But China, in this sense, is a much greater set of enormous estates that not even in the Roman Empire at the peak of the late antique latifundium are really seen by the same dimension. Where comparatively, even a Roman colonist of the 5th century had sort of more individual capacity, was seen just by the elite in a metaphysical sense as more valuable than a Chinese peasant, right, growing rice in the paddies. There is a disproportion, a great sclerotization, which makes things much more dangerous as a whole. Administratively speaking, the Chinese Empire has also wide areas that are practically autonomous. They work as individual kingdoms separated from central administration. They work pretty much in the same way, but they are usually entrusted to the children of the emperor, right? And factually, these are pretty slippery. In the Roman Empire, you do not actually have any of this. While it is true that, say, during the crisis of the 3rd century or later on in the 5th, you have, of course, a centrifugal push from the side of individual provinces. This does not correspond to the private or sort of simply national separation of these entities from even intentionally from the empire. It's rather that capacity that we explained before of the emperors not maintaining that individual capacity of leadership to make the state evaporate. In fact, if you look at largely like Western Europe, this empire lives on. Like the administration is still essentially the Roman one. The Germans preserve it as such. They start legislating in Latin. These areas are still today the most developed in the world. There is again, I mostly specialize in the 13th and the 14th century, but I know enough about medieval history in general to, and I showed this on Schwerpunkt, to reevaluate drastically the civilizational output of early medieval Europe, especially again countries like Italy, Gaul. Those are like chiefly so, but even Britain in its own relative backwardness in the way it organizes itself from the modern map, and according to like the Roman papal ecclesiastical administration. The same Spain, that even after the Moorish conquest was sort of inheriting an enormous lot in terms of what had been Roman administration, cities, right, that the Arabs also sort of maintained. Like, let's be honest, like these were Arabized elites, but the rest of the people were Spanish, right? There is no, not much of a discontinuity under certain points of view. This is not to say that there weren't major issues overall, but talking about the basic structure of this system. In all these peoples remain of the idea that there is a collective unity, right? There is a great historiographical output regarding when is that the concept of Europe started to, I would add, supersede the sense of the empire, right? That we can say we are Europeans now as opposed to being Holy Roman Imperial subjects in a broader sense. This started happening from just the end of the Middle Ages, like the Catholic, let's say, unity, especially the split between the Christianity regulated as far as maintaining a spiritual standard with a specifically trained selected priesthood, etc., to contend with the lay authority to to check it, because as we've seen, this had not been enough eventually to save the world as it had promised to do during the golden age of Augustus and when Christ had been born. So everything fit the prophecy of the regenerated Apollo of the new era, had conferred a true unity to what we see otherwise as a chronically fragmented political system. Europe, in this sense, was much more homogeneous, politically and culturally. Politically and spiritually, I would say specifically, than China. Right? We see, of course, like there are the jokes about whites and Asians like looking at each other, not being able to distinguish the various differences and all this stuff. But it's obvious that China was substantially different within itself. The only thing is that, as I was saying before, at the beginning of the video, like you don't see in China different states within China. When paradoxically, these kingdoms do exist, but they're much more fluid, right? So while, say, Gaul always remained Gaul and Britain always remained Britain, well, okay, it's an island, but say Germany, in a way, in spite of her lack of an eastern frontier, was Germany. Italy was Italy. Spain was Spain, right? And largely there are other areas that also share this continuities in a slightly less defined way, but that when appears, especially in the early Middle Ages, we're talking Central Eastern Europe, the Balkans, sort of remain what we see today, right? So in China, there isn't such a thing. In China, yes, there are historical regions, but they are not states. They're not countries that at some point found other empires or starting to venture out there, or are even particularly stable. Why? Because the tip of the balance in terms of the political social equilibrium was sclerotized. Right? You had just a very few people at the top, a very few sort of demilitarized people, a very lot demilitarized people at the bottom. And so it just took to shift, like to to behead that elite, to re-seize some of these estates, to even, live off of them without necessarily a great deal of administrative continuity in a local way. And you definitely see that China does change its internal balance, does change dynasties. There are states that fragment themselves, others that reunite at a certain point. None of this follows the more or less, homogeneous political pattern that Europe has, right? Especially after that point. It is true that these steppe nomads are very aggressive and that they prevent, a bit like in Eastern Europe, the stabilization of a florid state and culture and whatever. But it's also true that the internal system of China is inviting these guys further, right? And we made lots of videos. We've seen how it was easy, say, for an invader to cross all of China at some point. Say not easy, but you have multiple instances in which raids were sent all across, etc. In Europe, you don't really have this, right? What you have at best is an Attila that raids a bit here and there, walking on the edges of the empire, and then his empire melts away. That's pretty much it. The Germans literally just move as pockets, single peoples, and stabilize in that region, and they were just a few hundreds kilometers away. In China, it's something completely different. You have these guys coming from the bowels of Central Asia. They're vicious steppe nomads that managed to take over dynastically at some point, creating enormous damage, by the way, to the state, these various areas. In Europe, you never have anything of this kind. The nomads fail badly in Europe. Always. Right? You have at best, the most successful ones are the Bulgars and the Magyars in the early Middle Ages. But that's it. Right? And they are successful because they sedentarize quickly and manage to stabilize on a national territorial basis, also in areas that historically had not had much of a, let's say, of a permanent political foundation, right? This is I would say also one very important aspect, that the nomads that you see causing the mess in Europe during the migration era are not taking over Europe again, and it's rather the domino effect produced when they force for example, the Germanic peoples to press on the Roman boundaries, to just make them enter in the Roman boundaries, and with a substantial ethnic minority, and also one that, with, I'd say, settling regions with millions of people comparatively to their maximum, few hundred thousand in the great. We're talking just the Ostrogoths and the Longobards, by the way. And at that size, there is a debate about that as well. Some say that there were fewer, others say that also other peoples maybe 100,000, like the other. But this is not the point. The point is that these Germanic peoples have been living, first of all, not in the steppes, right? Not even the most steppes influenced Ostrogoths are a nomadic people, right? They maintain a semi-nomadic phase at best, but they're actually sedentary Germans that were agriculturers that basically moved at a certain point because of these general troubles and resettle as sedentaries, right? Very, very, very differently from the Turco-Mongolian peoples. But plus, and more importantly, these Germans have been living for half of a millennium next to Rome. It's not to say, somewhere out there and suddenly popping up, literally being fundamentally within the Roman Empire themselves. Because, of course, the legions on the Rhine and on the Danube were not just to control, to protect the inner side from the outer side. It was actually just to control peoples from both sides of the rivers. Because that's also what a military presence must be just for controlling from a center in an imperial way other peoples, right? While, of course, and this is, of course, crucial also for and underrated for the peoples who lived in this allegedly outside space, Romanizing, undergoing a Romanization, right? And this is incredibly true for the Germans as well. The Germans are heavily Romanized, after all, in a broader civilizational sense. I mean, compared to the Mongols that take over China at the collapse of the Han, like, there is no comparison. It is not to say that the Chinese did not influence the Central Asians from quite a while, but they lived in a completely different way, right? Whereas, more or less, like the Romans and the Germans lived in similar ways. The Germans had remained, of course, more tribal. Their politics were more precarious. They came to confederate only by, consistently offensive sense only from the 3rd century AD. They were themselves wanting to preserve the Romanity that they well knew, because, again, few hundred kilometers they were serving into the Roman military from ever. They were heavily influenced in their arms and armor. They knew the Romans for really, really quite a while, right? And these were all some sort of cousin peoples, together with the Celts and others, that knew each other without too much of a. If you pick a map, like it's of the world, you realize that. Making me pick myself to get the right mood and feeling about this. But I mean, Europe appears much more compact, like less dispersive than China, right? It's difficult for a major landmass to open to an enormous frontier just to maintain the internal cohesion to withstand these blows, right? In Europe, it's just mostly France that takes on this character, but France is in the West. It doesn't basically receive any Eastern or nomadic wave, right? And it basically takes over Europe as a continentally hegemonic power, right? Essentially stabilizing further on heavily advanced and sedentary and rich and populated areas, right? China has a problem as far as being able to stem the permeability of this enormous system that may be very compact, more very dense in the more developed areas, but also has this many others to just at some point only nominally control. It's as if, I don't know, the Roman Empire at some point had some kingdom under control that had to manage with a much more active step in where the Veneti lived, right? Or as if I don't know, they controlled Iran at some point. So it's difficult and complex to make comparisons to a degree. It doesn't even make too much sense. But they are two very different boundaries, frontiers, right? The Carpathians, the Sudeten, they are the Balkan Mountains, the Alps, the Dinaric Alps are all very important layers of defense that China doesn't quite have, especially with that level of demilitarization of, say, of its people in front of this relentlessly aggressive nomadic populations. How do you take over Europe, right? Even the Mongols later on. I made a video explaining why, in my opinion, they would have never conquered Europe, nor they probably even never planned anything of that kind, because Europe is not a place where you knock out the head and everything falls. There are so many different heads, right? This is a point that Machiavelli was making in a similarly archetypal way between, say, France and the Ottoman Empire. You can kill the French king, but in order to take over France, you have to fight against mini states within France that are run by her nobility. Whereas the Turk is really scary because it has really a professional army, a state, etc. But if you take out Constantinople, everything falls. And it does so quite fragorously. So, again, yet another example, you can't force too much. But China is, again, much more difficult to defend in many ways, and it has put itself in this condition to an extent. I will not, surely we will make videos explaining the relations between China and the steppes that is quite articulated. I made multiple videos already, for example, on the spread of the stirrup and how the Chinese were actually quite the Han underwent a major military reform that was properly aiming at copying the shock cavalry tactics of the steppes by importing the heavenly horses from the Fergana Valley, properly investing enormous amounts of estates, etc., and manpower to breed these horses, to provide like a massively statically sustained heavy cavalry that before had never existed in that dimension. So it's always like a very strong clash with the steppe. The Romans do this too in many ways. Like they do have to defend the frontier from peoples like the Sarmatians. But again, there was no chance for a Sarmatian to take over the Roman Empire, right? And even, for example, the Alans that entered Europe during the 5th century, they do actually as a crushed people, scattered in other groups, larger groups that are the Germanic ones, and they actually signed, and I made a video about this, with the empire as opposed to the Germans tendentially when they are inside, for different reasons. So this is the difference, in my opinion, between the Chinese, say, and the Mediterranean, the European civilization. It's similar, but not really quite the same. The Romans, before them, the Hellenistic powers had protected the Mediterranean since from quite a while, from Alexander's times, indeed. But there are some. Even think about the Persian wars in a sense, like the Achaemenids were something very different from, of course, some brutal Eastern invaders. But what the Hellenic polis were up to, by standing their ground, and challenging the universal empire of that time, which they were actually themselves, is really formidable, right? The Achaemenids were bringing lots of steppe peoples with their cavalry, and there was a sense that of this east pushing, right, from different directions. But overall, it's Rome that affirms a permanent statehood, right? While the East is run by largely how the previous civilizations had done, like the Alexander, Rome fundamentally maintained that because the peoples are also a bit more demilitarized in these areas. They're habituated to obey to pharaohs, to kings of kings, right? They had they were easier to run compared to, again, the more brutal Europeans. The West is instead ever more reinforced in a truly statal and civic sense that, paradoxically, and a culturalist would never accept that. That's why structuralists never tell you that in history books, that corresponded to that, say, what we see in the sense of something republican or democratic was actually about a meritocratic culture that told to every person, if you show me that you're enough. And Rome required great sacrifice in order to become a citizen, etc. Which mostly happened through military service, and so this capacity of maintaining control the solidity of the empire and say the general quality of the spiritual principle, you can be elevated to the rank, to the status, to the condition of the conquerors that are the chosen people and divinely blessed, right? I would say that even the competition among these various European populations made them ever more aware about who was really the guy who had it, who was chosen by God to rule over the others. This is something that dies a bit earlier in places like India or China, because they are sort of large, massive pools of largely undistinguished populations. Right, they're different, they're varied, but they more or less develop around, for example, all along a single unbroken valleys. Right, the major endemic concentration, the Yellow River, the Indus, the Ganges, etc. Europe doesn't have this. It has different, rich hydrographic reality that all the great European states sort of are born out of different valleys, like of the Thames, the Seine, the Rhine, the Po, the Tiber, right? But and there are many others along the way. I'm missing so many, but you know what I'm talking about. But Europe doesn't have a single major valley. It's not like a place that you can simply run without understanding the importance of cooperation between the various elements. Right? It's too difficult, and that's why we're so diversified, but at the same time similar at different levels, at a higher unitary one. Right? India, China, they are of course very complex countries, just in the way they also, like, because of other of invaders, right, that came to diversify them ethnically, culturally, religiously, right? But overall, like, as a broader pool of demographic basin, etc., they're more or less concentrated along the same places that they historically tended to simply make them be, without further internal reorganizations or remestation. Naturally, this is not to say that they didn't undergo major troubles, right? And that, as we will see now, of course, both the Guptas were factually destroyed. Like they collapsed into a myriad of different little states and so on. But you see, what happened in Europe, paradoxically, was much more unitary in nature. As I was saying before, yes, we think about the Middle Ages as the greatest fragmentation ever, but if you actually look at it, it's not much a fragmented system in a constitutional way, meaning that if you look at a political map like the ones I upload about, say, Germany during the 13th century, okay, you see hundreds of different states and you say, what the hell is this? But it still worked in a German way, right? In a single, distinguished, characteristic way. And that was also the peak of that fragmentation. It's not that Germany was ever disappearing into that fragmentation. When you look at India or China, or the great empires and dynasties that had existed at some point, yes, you have this power emerging at a certain point, becoming more dominant, then a dynastic conflict, and this fell, and whatever. And it's not like these single chunks of European countries more or less remain the same. You can think that feudal history is a mess, but if you look at the gradual political molding, it's always like, again, England, France, like it's always the same thing, right? You don't have a sign that, aside from certain shading, these systems were ever dramatically altered. That was something like in between that floated and circulated and could bless either one or the other, right? This is instead very, very evident in China or in India. What happened with the Roman Empire is, in fact, simply this evaporation rather than a shift in political power. See, China was trying to maintain the legacy of the empire in a more chaotic way. With Rome, you have the shift in power within the empire itself, as basically Constantinople is still the unitary empire. Yes, later you have the West resuming the empire, but it's basically just these two, right? You don't have another one, right? So they're big, massive, sort of century-old, phenomena that sort of reflect still the idea of a Latin, Germanic West and sort of Slavic, Greek East of some sort. But you never find somebody taking the idea of the empire so lightly to associate it to just his personal, or temporarily dynastic issue, right? The empire is truly sacred to a degree that also the church comforts in a way that it has a very strong continuity. I would say that this is also, there is a beautiful comparison with Islam. Like Islam is messed up, right? Just those other East Asian powers. Like you have so many different centers rising and falling, and just because of some individual adventures. Think about the Fatimids. Think about the struggles between the Shia and the Sunni. And this stems from one apparently banal fact, that is the fact that there is no priesthood in Islam, right? Imams are not priests, and essentially the spiritual authority is within the same earthly ruler. And this makes it essentially all more dynamic, agitated. Also, the same Islamic conquests at the beginning are enormous, like they stretch from the Atlantic to the Indus. But they also agitate, fragment very easily, and there is not much trust in earthly authority, because it's meant in that spiritual control to alienate that, like from say to go against divine will, essentially, to claim it, not to be able to maintain it. Christendom does a completely different thing. Christendom has a church that does not belong to the earth, that cooperates with the emperor, because, as we've seen, now it's established that there is no such thing like, by standard, by legitimate concern of these Europeans, that there can be an imperial authority capable of embodying also the sacrality, the level of spirituality required to save the world. If they had had it, they would have reunited the entire Christendom under their control, restored the Roman Empire, and this does not happen in a unitary sense. And I would like to point out that while the West has this quite intense dialectic, think about the investiture controversy between the papacy and the empire, and it expands dramatically in that divided way, but still with a unitary force that can be considered as one. The Byzantine Empire declines. And the Byzantine Empire distinguished itself from the West because while the church was separated ideally from, like in a metaphysical sense, from the earth, right? In Constantinople, the emperors were the head of the same church. So they were the vicars of Christ themselves, because they considered themselves in a Caesar-papistic way, and the church was quite submissive. So even titles like the one of Sevastocrator, etc., speak of that ancient standard of royal divinity, that, however, is not fully met by the empire that declines compared to the West, that instead is extremely prosperous. It's as if the West managed to make up for the lack of a sacred ruler uniting the temporal and spiritual authority by creating this effective processes in which the spiritual and temporal authority cooperate within the same Holy Roman Empire and are responsible for one another, right? And work in order to re-achieve that discipline in order that that can make a civilization florid and vital. And when you look at the Gothic cathedrals, when you realize that the expansion of Frankish Europe, the development of the Latin Church and the standards of living and the wealth and the power, you realize that it doesn't matter how this world is traumatized by the loss of the imperial unity happened in the past, but still it manages to reactivate those sacred resources that are the same ones that the West uses further, in spite of all problems with this still functional muscles that haven't atrophied differently from other peoples, and that is essentially what you witness in the rest of Western history, even when you have further degenerations of tradition, like the Protestant Reformation or, say, modernism, etc. Because the understanding that in the West we have that in potential the individual can achieve an infinite attainment is considered in a sense sacred. This is not democracy. This is not giving people stuff for free. This has nothing to do with that, right? It misses one part of the sign, but it's recognizing that there is something so sacred that nobody can touch in terms of being so, say, being hypocritical to judge everything to the point of depriving him of any power, like an autocrat would do, like a Chinese emperor would do, like a communist dictator would do. Nobody has a saying in anything. We must silence them. We must oppress them. We must essentially think they're not even worth being used as mankind. The West never undergoes this. The West always fights also within itself. We shed more blood among each other than towards, like, think about during the Middle Ages, those who attack us, right? We have an enormous potential, we can unite, but we prefer to invest, unite to expand, but we prefer to invest boosting ourselves from the within. We prefer regulating our disputes. Why? Because there is a spiritual standard that we want to preserve. That's how we kill each other between Protestants and Catholics for centuries, for apparently no reason, but the one that there is a liminal standard, right? Who are you to pretend you can save yourself, right? But who are you to claim that you can't, right? This is the ultimate question of our Western tradition, and this is truly a universal one. Like, the one is being fought in the world is exactly the same, and the right side is difficult to equivocate, right? So the Roman Empire, as you know, tried to stabilize the frontiers, like the movements of peoples from the north, from the east, but it could not prevent the eruption. And so it had at least to shrink in the 5th century AD. I will not digress on how, let's say, this happened, but as I was saying before, like, and we've seen often in the videos about the Romano-Germanic world, you have functionally a Roman aristocracy that mingles, let's say, with the Germanic warrior one, the senatorial episcopal one, right, with a warrior one, and creates a true Latin Germanic culture that works on the same basis of the Roman administration. It doesn't destroy it, because the Germans do not destroy it, do not destabilize it in a catastrophic sense, unless it was like very weak, like in Britain, because of lack of resources, or because the Byzantines, for example, want to reconquer Italy from the Goths that up to that point were actually governing pretty well, like with the, aside from certain tensions, mostly due to the fact that yes, they knew in fact the Byzantines could reconquer the peninsula in that way, and that caused major destruction in the war. But only like that, and still with Italy maintaining the upper hand of higher per capita wealth in the history uninterruptedly from Roman times to the 17th century, to the late 17th century. So what you see is not much a destructuration of a political territorial reality, just an evaporation of the say the imperial extension, and a large continuation on the basis of its own communities and administration that at best like shrink because of the general material poverty of that Eurasia undergoes dramatically everywhere. Like those who lived in the Barbarian out there actually were living in a terrible condition, and that's the reason why they had been moving in the first place. But you see, the steppes guys do not actually make it. In Europe, it's rather the Germans that are, again, sedentaries at the end of the day, and that are also very close to the Romans culturally and geographically and historically, that sort of enter and create what remains largely a Romance reality, but that is also able to compenetrate the same Germanic world in the early Middle Ages and expand, say, structuring them, elevating it. So with that, European civilization truly lives on, right, in a truly also continental way, aside from the Mediterranean, right? In China, you don't have this. In India, you don't have this. You don't have a people that has been civilized, that is almost completely sedentary, and that simply moves in and substitutes itself to the local army. And everything works pretty much as it was. You have brutal invasions that surely exploit the local administration and whatever, but also engulf the entire freaking system to a level of unprecedented instability, with continuous raids, a continuous protracted struggle that truly never ends during the Middle Ages. Right, in Europe you have the migration here, and then there's the major movement. Again, no sedentary people, no nomadic people makes it fundamentally, aside from areas that were largely depopulated, like again, already from before, like the Pannonian Plain, and the invasions are over. Yes, the Mongols arrive in the 13th century, but do they go anywhere? Right, the only territorial polity that they managed to establish west of the Urals is in the steppe proper, on the Volga, and up to Ukraine. Not even into Ukraine proper, like not even the Russian Palatinate. We've seen it. So the rest of Europe technically never has, and sort of never had, this problem that China always had, yet the next nomadic people that will invade it and will take over its more or less unitary empire. Europe never knows this. Attila's Huns were a joke in comparison. We just made a mess out of them because they're the ugly, bad, terrible people that arrived. And what did they do? Right? Did they have any chance to conquer Europe? No. Right? They wanted actually the Roman Empire to remain standing, because as long as it stood, it could pay them more tribute. Right? And the empire dissolved. The Hunnic Empire dissolved also pretty quickly after Attila's demise. Right? So it's not this dramatic, disturbing thing, without mentioning that technically, like the Byzantine Empire remains for many peoples in Europe a reference of Romanity. Like before Charlemagne, objectively, we explained this often, it's a misunderstood concept. The sense that a Roman Empire still existed was pretty much alive up to Britain or Scandinavia. As I always like to remember it, that there were 10th century Anglo-Saxon kings that styled themselves in some documents not as imperatores but as basileioi, which means that still they saw, especially Northern Europe, that during the Viking era and around that time, like had this long circle connection with Constantinople through the Rus, like to Eastern Europe, was extremely sensitive to the fact that the Roman Empire was still there. Again, that it's not like, okay, the western half of the empire falls, so, down the curtains, now the Germans come in and that's it. It's actually just deeply felt by all these peoples that had always known the empire and had always known its immensity, that lasted for centuries and centuries, that thing had left a mark that was not over. First of all, because the empire still existed, but also because everybody wanted to recover its power. Right, from the Merovingians to the Carolingians to the Ottonians and beyond. And how can you deprive, of course, a European civilization based on these premises, on functional Romano-Germanic kingdoms that go on civilizing, evangelizing, clearing, converting, expanding, educating, right? That this is not a direct continuation of Romantic in many ways, right? So this is, I think, self-evident whenever you observe even the resistance of post-Carolingian Europe during the age of the so-called second invasions, right? We see an empire collapsing, but what did really happen, right? Essentially, the blood and soul of Europe sort of autonomized itself compared, say, from this privatistic system, right? So it's not really anything collapsed within. Actually, the 10th century is actually the beginning of the expansion of the so-called year 1000 that came actually 100 years before that. So exactly the moment in which the second invaders hit the hardest, and that actually accomplished nothing, right? The only area that could be destabilized by the Saracens, between the Saracens, the Magyars, and the Normans was, in part, was, let's say, it's a bit of a paradox. Like in Britain, you have the Anglo-Saxons suffering heavily, but also like a sense of English nation emerging at that point in a just politically unitary way, probably a kingdom, and the eastern half of Germany by the Magyars that did really risk at some point to make Saxony, Thuringia, and Bavaria collapse as districts, but as provinces, but that's it. These peoples all fail. They are subsumed by the West in a way or another. Like the Scandinavians are converted to Christianity, they are feudalized, and they enter fully the Roman Catholic system. The Magyars are beaten by the Ottonians, brought down, settled down, Christianized, Roman Catholicism, they are there. The Saracens are wiped out, right? The Italian maritime republics of Pisa and Genoa sweep the entire Western Mediterranean. They start monopolizing the sea again. And all this, like, we are essentially only half of a millennium after late antiquity sort of went to sleep, right? You have the same power of the Crusaders, of the Gothic cathedrals, of the great national monarchies, of the Italian communes, etc. in that span, right? It's all compact in Europe there. It's evidently a product of a former, say, development that had been starting under Rome or even before that. Think about the Celts, like in Gaul especially, how their Oppidan road networks had been important also for the Romans to graft themselves on. China is very advanced, don't get me wrong, but it's also in that sense more politically chaotic, right? It's more Latin Germanic Europe is slow, right? There are other powers that are more dynamic even around it, right? But this slowness has behind this relentless internal build-up, this relentless reflection, relentless persistence of the Romano-Germanic awareness of the nobility of those who bear arms, even as humble freemen, if they are that capable, right? The Chinese autocracy is very different. The Indian one is very different, right? And so it's much easier to change on the basis of that elite, like the center of power, because more or less the place is not going to put a lot of resistance against the new ruler, the newcomer. I think this is incredibly important. The Gupta dynasty, we didn't talk too much about them. This was a genuinely Indian dynasty emerging, restoring the historical largest extent of the Indian imperial boundaries, right? And this is also a complex process. We don't have time to digress on, but to make long story short, the Guptas notoriously created an administrative and military system of remarkable efficiency in the prosper Ganges Valley. And that, however, as I would say, like having studied mostly ancient and modern India, being, however, sort of doomed to soften and crumble once again. This is the problem of all Indian rulers, maintaining a central system before this feudalizing, privatizing to the point of generating another rebellion, fragmentation, until a strong man comes out again. Never does it. This is true for most empires, but in India it's really chronic, right? And the reason being the overwhelming, like this system is immense demographically and agriculturally, so everybody has basically the means to autonomize locally, right? It doesn't matter how powerful the state is in this more urbanized and agricultural areas. It's also like everything repops up everywhere in terms of rebellions, of attrition, etc. And in the 5th century, when also Indian culture in a sense was gradually like the Roman one, not falling from a day to another, like already there was a demographic and agricultural crisis of some sort, mostly due for all these empires, Rome, the Han, and the Guptas, because mostly of internal clashes, let's stress this, was entirely overwhelmed in the 5th century by an atrocious invasion of Huns, right, from Central Asia, which is also very underappreciated in many ways. Like all these peoples, for example, I don't know, think about the Ephthalites, how they were a problem even for the Sasanians. Today we didn't talk Persia too much, but it's not comparable really to these other systems, at least at the peak of their extension. And as you know, so Persia fundamentally collapses, and there's not much that it comes to be compared to antiquity as well. The Persian Empire undergoes that crisis as well. Like in ancient times, to control Mesopotamia. The fact of this would never happen again. Yes, the Seljuks that we were talking about yesterday do a sort of thing like that, but it's not like the state that the great Achaemenids or the Sasanians had managed to, or even the Parthians at some point with their Mesopotamian control, had managed to instate, and that was also regularly crushed by first the Macedons, then the Romans. Right, the Romans marched on Ctesiphon multiple times. Of course, the Persians didn't on Rome. So it's I chose deliberately not to bring Persia in the equation, because it seemed to me that in terms of major civilizations like India and China were more representative of the East compared to Europe, right? So what is that? Like, also for India, I inserted this in the title, not as a clickbait, but I know I haven't been talking much about it, and it's more like a general, approach as philosophy of history, but also like an important assessment that I make on top of years of having observed these things. India is also and unequivocally having a much less level of statal development than the West has, right? Don't think in that sense that quantity simply means a qualitative level of development. India does not have, in a civic, administrative, or military sense, the level of centrality, of professionalism, of bureaucracy, of permanence of China or of Rome. It's a wilder country. It has enormous internal issues for allowing that centralization. It's also a very privatistic system as well. It's more disorderly than China, but it has this sense stronger seigneurial basis. The Chinese managed to control again better. Their population is more disciplined. It's more framed in that social order and hierarchy. India is much messier. Like, there are lords everywhere with their castles, with their elephant armies, and their general capacity of replenishing also demographically, the losses, etc. So it's incredibly complicated. Technically, the Huns do not take over India. In fact, they're finally pushed back. But they managed to destroy the Guptas. There are some of them that resist at some point, then the entire system manages to push the Huns away. But these have accomplished effectively the destruction of the Indian Empire that turns into an incredibly fragmented way. Unlike even China and Europe, right? China still holds this enormous chunks to get, they stand individually and they all claim that imperial grandeur in a sense. So yes, it's a broken China, but it's not so highly fragmented like India after the Hunnic invasions. Nor Europe is, as you understand. It's like the Romano-Germanic kingdoms are just a bunch fundamentally in the major regional areas. Like, there is nothing so intermediate between them. And this also because it follows, as we were saying, the Roman provincial administration. By the way, the Romans, we've seen this in the videos about Diocletian, etc., also had a hell of a bureaucracy, a hell of a statal control that in that capillary fashion was unknown even to China. Like, let's say it was not, China was more bureaucratic, meaning that the resources they spent for bureaucracy were likely less functional than the Roman ones, but the Roman ones were very much down the local level in a districtual sense. It mostly had to do with the maintenance of the army, of course, but that basis is incredibly important because the Roman districts are the same ones eventually of the Christian dioceses, of the Frankish counties, of the communes. Like, so it's an incredibly, of course there is a continuity like this also in China and partially in India as well, but it's never as orderly as eventually Europe is. And basically, again, Europe is also well sheltered. India is sheltered too, by the mountains in the north, but again, it's not geography that dictates how eventually things are going to play. India is also invaded multiple times in its history and taken over. China wasn't, in the sense that, yes, the enemy dynasties managed to install themselves, but they didn't manage to alter, let's say, to change the Chinese fundamentals. Like India at some point is run by the Muslims, even though it's mostly a Hindu country. The same goes for Europe. Nobody takes over Europe and changes its culture, right? Not even, again, Islamic Spain, as we were saying before, is actually falling short much of our sense of Westernness after it's reconquered by the Christians, right? Because also in there, like, the same Arabs were just, the minority, and in general they were operating on, in that case, the Roman bases, also the Persian ones in Mesopotamia, and beyond, right? So one has always to appreciate also how long-lasting the various dynasties were, for example, and how autochthonous they were. China had these so many different dynasties falling, let's say, dying out relatively shortly, right? We were talking about the Khitai recently, for example. Well, Europe, again, doesn't have anything of this. There's nobody arrives and establishes his own dynasty. You have these various countries that at most have royal dynasties that sort of last, but they die out mostly out of dynastic extinction, not because of particularly tremendous events, like during, for example, the Hunnic, well, this is a bit earlier, but I mean, during the Hunnic invasion of China, there is like several emperors that are killed by the Huns, which means that there was a prepotent foreign intrusion in Chinese affairs, for that matter. And so that's something you want to appreciate. Like, we don't have this in Europe, right? We can't kill each other, and we can't have polities that are stuffing about the Bulgars, later Bulgarians overall, that because of the Slavic majority locally, that say kill, they fight against the Byzantines, etc. But they are one, again, of the many European polities, and they do not overrun practically anything that previously existed in that place in a unitary sense, right? Constantinople is besieged countless times, it doesn't fall. The Westerners, in spite of danger, managed to curb down, say, the Islamic penetration that could have not been that threatening at once it reached like the Western extremes in the first place. There is a capacity of reconquest and of consolidation. Europe is not touched practically by anyone. Yes, there are the Ottomans, but the Ottomans are essentially a Western thing. Like, they're born in Bithynia and on the Bosphorus. They are like on the Marmara Sea. They are really like part of the same Europe in many ways. Well, this is my view overall. It's of course based very sketchily on the time available, because I couldn't really present here. I don't know whether I surpassed the 3 hours. I hope not so, because otherwise I have to upload in sort of different chunks. Oh my god, I fear so. Let's hope not. Reason for which is better if I cut short. Wait a second. It's 16 plus it's 24 plus 50, 74, 77. Yeah, okay, it's definitely not 3 hours, but almost, right? Reason for which I have to silence me in a quite quick fashion if I want to avoid uploading, because technical problems. I don't tell you why that's the case. I can't upload videos longer than 3 hours, at least with the audio still functioning, so that's pretty much it. But I mean, this is an idea. The beginning of the video is to scare away the people who disagree with me politically, etc. So the rest arrives always later. As the Latins said, dulcis in fundo, or sweet is at the end. Not just as a dessert, but just like the pulp, the core in this case. Very well. I noticed that some videos I uploaded recently made lots of views, which were unthinkable even up to 1 year ago. At Majore, right? I thank you always for the support, of course. This video is insanely complex and sort of, as you understand, I don't even have a sketch like to prepare it. But we will surely be talking about similar topics soon. I just throw them as a provocation, fundamentally, and I love to see what effect they make. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.